Infinity Nation and beyond, we look at the status of your digital landscape and how it affects the growth and profitability of your business. On the show, we will be talking to business leads, partners in the e-commerce world, as well as some of our own specialist team to give you actionable insights and find solutions to help you on your growth journey today. We will consider new ideas, stretch our mindsets beyond the status quo, and in the process discover how to gain an edge on the competition and drive some great results.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to our podcast today. Today we're joined by Ffion, who's our head of paid media, and today we're going to talk about growth performance and how to get best from a partnership in paid media.
Yes.
Exciting. So, in your role as paid media manager, you've worked in a number of different places, different agencies, different verticals. What do you see as big differences between a traditional agency and a growth partner?
I think the biggest difference between a traditional agency, I guess I started my career working for traditional agencies, so you'll get a huge amount of expertise, as you will in a growth partner, but I think the main difference is the mindset. And I think because for a traditional agency, you kind of have a channel, they're managing the channel for you, and they will have a team that is skilled and has the expertise to work within that channel. But what they're not necessarily doing, which a growth partner would do, is think about it from the client's perspective and think of that mindset of spending the budget like it's their own, for example, and thinking we're working together to achieve the client's growth ambition. So I think that's the main difference, is that mindset, because ultimately it can be similar things that they're doing in the day-to-day, especially with the team when they're optimizing and looking at insights, but really it's the perspective that they're coming from will always be, how can I go above and beyond? Because ultimately for them, they're working towards that growth target at a growth agency rather than at a traditional agency where they probably have their own target and it's a bit more siloed.
Yeah, I think that the siloed point is really intriguing, isn't it? It's how do we use all of the channels at our disposal to help them achieve their growth target? Are there certain channels that we need to put more effort and budget into because we can see a better performance from those, and actually other channels that aren't working as well? So we can be dynamic across a multitude of channels. I think the other thing is, I think the key point you also said is being that growth partner. It's not just going month on month, we've made an improvement. It's actually, this is how we've performed this month. That's how it compares to the month previously. But knowing where the top of your mountain is, we still need to keep pushing, or actually, there's a Q4's on its way, we're just over 90 days to Black Friday.
Yes.
What's the run rate looking like up until that? I think that's a key difference for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it comes back on that first point to spending budget as if it's your own as well. With a traditional agency, obviously it completely depends on their business model, but sometimes there can be an incentive to spend more money in that channel because ultimately they might take a percentage of that money and that might be how they make their fee. Whereas we'll never have that with a growth agency because you only want to spend the money where it's most efficient for the client. So it's going to be different, and the way that we approach budget will be totally different from an agency that works in that way. It has its benefits. If you have smaller media spends, it can be a more efficient fee.
Yes.
But ultimately there's that downside of you never know if ultimately the agenda is different from what the client's agenda would be. And yeah, exactly. I think working towards that growth target is ultimately we're going to be looking for bigger opportunities outside of that channel. So even if it's something that we don't manage in-house, if it's something that we think the client could be doing better, we're always going to recommend that. Whereas that might be a little bit, why would a traditional agency even bother spending time thinking about that? Because they're not being paid to do that, so they're not going to think outside of the box in that way. Yeah,
and I think you're right in terms of, I've always been nervous having come from client side. I always found it dubious that it's a percentage of spend, because in my world, maybe I'm a cynic, it always makes me feel like people are incentivized to spend more budget because they're going to earn more rather than sort of honest day's pay for an honest day's work. So interesting one. More recently, I suppose, with PMax and as the Google platform, not only just Google, but if we talk about Google initially, is as that platform evolves, I'm getting more and more questions of why do we need a growth partner? Why do we need an agency? I just set PMAX off, set and forget. It just runs itself.
Yeah.
What do you say? How do you deal with that?
I think that's definitely a thought that probably people have, and it's not just Performance Max, it's Facebook as well with its latest kind of automated campaign update. But I think firstly, the conditions for success still need to be set for Performance Max. You still need to have the feed optimized to best practice, you need audiences to be correct, you need creatives to be right, and you need the right amount of data coming out of that campaign for it to even work. We see that it works for half our clients where they have enough data coming out, but sometimes it doesn't work because there's not enough conversion data to feed back in. So I think firstly, it's not good enough to just set it up and let it run, because it might not be set up to best practice.
Sure.
But secondary to that, if it's set up, it's working, it works for 3 weeks, and then it stops working, what would you do if you didn't know why it was working in the first place? You didn't know why you set it up, why it was working, and suddenly you're reliant on that campaign and it stopped working completely. What would you do? I think that's where having the expertise comes in, because we'd never solely rely on just that one campaign type. We'd make sure that we'd spread budget across different campaigns that then work together, so that if for some reason something stops working, the audience change slightly, we can adapt to that.
Yes.
But we also know that we've set it up to give it the best chance of success in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there does seem to be this tendency at the moment to have eggs in one basket. We've looked at a couple of businesses recently, new opportunities that were north of 80% of revenue through paid search alone. I know we're focusing on paid search today, but for me, that's a high risk strategy in terms of the business being susceptible to a rising cost per click, cost of acquiring a customer. So, again, I think what you're saying there in terms of spreading that risk is still looking to achieve the client's growth scenario, but also give them a robust platform from which to grow, rather than just, we've seen it, and we, pure growth through Instagram, and then, algorithm changes or influencers, and they all fall away. And it's I don't know, it's a very high risk game in my opinion.
I think it's a strategy that you wouldn't take in other areas of the business. So why would you take it with digital marketing? Because if you were heavily reliant on one generator for the rest of your business, you'd immediately know that was a huge risk. So why would you just rely on Performance Max for Google? It just doesn't make sense. And I think it's kind of not understanding how the different campaigns can then all work together as well, and just being a bit just not getting the most out of your campaigns that you could be.
Sure. Okay. So we talked about PMAX, then we've mentioned shopping. I suppose, again, going back to this partnership, how do we help? How do we mitigate falling in pitfalls or rabbit holes, or what else are we bringing to the mix for our clients?
Yeah, I think that's another interesting point about Performance Max, because there's one very obvious example that if you're setting it up and you don't know exactly how the platform works, there is the chance of wasting a lot of budget. So if you just followed Google's instructions, for example, it would target the whole world, and you need to go in and change that to target the location that you actually want to target. So having people that are experienced in the platform will know that there's little things like that. There's nuances in the platforms that just from having the experience they'll know not to do. And I think it's utilising different experiences and having a range of people in the agency that have varied experiences themselves to then lean on each other and support. And I think that's what you don't get if you're relying on one person to do everything. Then their resources is stretched, and they don't have those people to bounce ideas off or think about what are the common pitfalls, what do I need to take into account, what can I avoid. And I think one thing that we also look at is how we can negate those things from happening in the first place. So things like negative keywords, we don't wait all the time until we've bid on them before we negate them. We can use tools to find them before it even happens. So it's you're not wasting the budget, you're avoiding that in the first place. It's not always possible, obviously. There's always going to be some keywords that come through that we can't foresee, but it's just making sure we've done everything we can, and then having the team to kind of spot check what other people are doing and doing those second checks to kind of have that quality assurance.
I think the other thing you've mentioned a couple of times there, which is I think is a real key benefit, is we're not sort of absolutely absorbed in the day-to-day of clients or businesses. So it helps us have a helicopter or wood from the trees view to say to them, oh, really interesting setup here, that's working well. Have you considered this? Because we've seen this strategy working for a diverse range of people or a different type of business. So I think it allows us to bring fresh impetus, fresh ideas into things. It'd be my view on it, but I'm happy to.
No, I completely agree. I think we have a good mix because we obviously have dedicated people that will work on clients day to day, and they'll spend a lot of their time working on that client, so they know it inside out. But then you have the people that can look at it, take a step back and think holistically, what is missing. And I think another point to that is often when you're so close to something, you might think a certain thing about the brand, but the data might say something completely different. And so it's good to have someone purely looking at the data without that kind of bias coming in where they've known it and they've made assumptions. It's just purely looking at the data and allowing that to inform the outcome and the insight, and then reporting that back as well, and how we can have those kind of debates about how things might not be as we thought they would be.
I suppose again, but that that challenge scenario, isn't it? We challenge the status quo. Is we might have done a test historically, didn't work. But does that mean we shouldn't do the test again? Or it's that scenario, isn't it? It's that test, measure, and evolve. And I think that's coming back to your data point. Is always challenging the status quo, testing again and again. And
I think to some extent challenging the best practice that, for example, Facebook or Google will state, because we've had a lot of times where it might have been questioned, a certain thing that we're doing. For example, ad copy length on Facebook, we might have been questioned saying that's too long. Facebook recommends 125 character limit, but actually we've tested it and your customer wants more information. They want to be over-informed. So actually putting a little bit more information in goes a long way. And again, you wouldn't know that until you tested it and just kind of pushed those boundaries a little bit.
Okay. What about using KPIs to your advantage? How are we using, I said, sort of across that broad set of customers, how can we see different KPIs and help elevate everyone's performance?
I think it's probably the most important thing to get right, because obviously it's how we're judging performance. And I think too often we find ourselves in a situation where we're trying to judge every single campaign, every single channel on the same KPI. I think with the kind of updates that happen with iOS and cookies changing next year, it's going to be more important to look at the macro level for success, at the overall uplift level, look at overall website performance, how is that increasing, rather than being too siloed and looking at each individual channel. But within those channels, we want to make sure we've got the right micro KPIs so we can kind of measure success on a weekly basis. And I think that's where it can go wrong if we're looking at a campaign that's set for awareness, but we're looking at it from a ROAS perspective. And then comparing that against brand. It's never going to be the same. And I think that's often a pitfall people can fall in. I think it's something that we talk about internally as that kind of football team analogy. Like you wouldn't judge every single player on a football team by the same measure of success. If you looked at your goalie and looked at how many goals they scored, you'd always think they were terrible, but that's not how we should be measuring them. So it's the same thing when you're looking at different campaigns should be measured based on the objective that they've been set up to achieve.
Okay, I like that analogy.
I thought you would.
I love an analogy. But you're talking then, I think that's really interesting in terms of the macro and this whole marketing ecosystem. As you say, I think with iOS 14, that's changed the world outside of most people's control. Cookies disappearing theoretically next year. I mean, can performance marketing work in a non-cookie world? I mean, those are the questions that I've seen come out lately. I don't know if you have a view on that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think we've been spoiled with data up until this point with digital marketing, but ultimately marketing worked in the past and that data wasn't accessible. So it still works. We're just going to have to accept that we can't prove it to the last click, the last interaction every single time. And that's why it's most important, I think, to look at that overall uplift. If we can see growth is happening and we've matched it back to our growth model and we're on track, and then we're using those micro KPIs to kind of measure and make sure we're moving in the right direction, then that's the evidence we need to showcase success.
Yeah. I can understand from a brand's point of view how it's becoming tougher for them to understand, and historically it's like, I spend money here, I can see that return, and I don't see how quickly Apple, Facebook might just sort this disagreement out. Will Google see through the cookies? Who knows? They sort of delayed it once, will they? I don't know, but
I think it's the future that we're all going to have to get used to. And I think even when we had all of the data available to us, it still wasn't as accurate as I think people believed it to be. There's obviously debates about different attribution models, and kind of cross-device attribution as well. And so in the past, where we thought this is probably 100% accurate, it wasn't anyway. So we're just, I think, all having to be a bit more educated on attribution and how we use it and understand it to really know whether something's working or not. Because I think then the opposite is true. It could be that if you don't understand it and someone is telling you that something's working, but you're not an expert in it, how do you know whether to trust them? And I think that's where that growth partner comes in as well, because if you're working to the same goal, you know that you're on the same page, and why would someone be not trustworthy in that instance?
Okay. And so going back to that growth partner piece, how is partnering with someone beneficial in your world? It's like the speed in which changes, algorithm modifications, etc., come through. How does a partner help a business navigate those?
I think with a partnership as well, I think what goes hand in hand with that is kind of having more open communication, and so having that trust and that solid relationship built, which you can only get really with a partnership, I think is the way to navigate that, because we can be honest and say, this was working yesterday, algorithm change, we have to change tact, and having that trust means that change can happen quicker.
Yeah.
If there's an instance where something's too rigid and we're just sticking with the same thing because it's always worked in the past, even though we know it's not going to work, but we're not able to adapt to it as quickly, then efficiency is going to drop. So I think it's having that kind of, that solid base to make sure that we know that the changes that we're making are always in the best interests.
Okay. And any view, and I'll throw this one at you, do you think there will be a backlash from consumers in a non-cookie world where the relevancy potentially of the ads aren't going to be as high to their likes, brands they like, products they like, versus the current world?
I actually have another analogy. This one I made up myself. And this one I kind of liken it to going to a supermarket and trying to do your weekly food shop. Everyone wants to do it as quickly as possible, because why do you want to spend time there? But you go down one aisle and it's got milk next to, I don't know, vodka. Like, why would you want those two things next to each other? It's going to take you twice as long to find anything that you want. And I think it's the same in advertising. People will start to see ads that are completely irrelevant to them because the ability to target is lessened, and you'll have more automated campaigns which are just throwing everything at everyone and seeing what sticks and then optimizing from there. And so I think people will, and already have been commenting saying, why am I seeing this ad? This isn't relevant to me, and not understanding that it's directly as a result of choosing to opt out of cookies and therefore taking the ability away to make them relevant. So yeah, I completely think that there will be a backlash, but I think the issue of privacy is too important to most people for them to think that that benefit of a relevant ad outweighs them keeping ownership of their own data. Yeah,
it may change. They get frustrated with it. Brilliant. That's it for me. I think it was really useful to hear about some growth partnerships and the difference you've experienced. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure we'll do another one soon.
Sounds good.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ffion.
Thank you.